It began with a small frontier principality, one of many scattered along the fading edges of a dying empire. By its end, it would rule across 3 continents, endure for more than 6 centuries, and leave an indelible mark on the political, religious, and cultural map of the modern world. Yet, despite its vast reach and longevity, the story of the Ottoman Empire is often told in fragments. A sultan here, a battle there, a final collapse. But what truly was this empire? How did it rise from obscurity to become the seat of the Islamic Caliphate? And why did its decline stretch over centuries rather than ending in a single dramatic fall? This is not merely a tale of rise and fall, it is a deeper journey through power, adaptation, and endurance across the shifting centuries of history. This is the complete story of the Ottoman Empire. Let us begin. At the dawn of the 14th century, the political landscape of Anatolia was a patchwork of fractured territories, nothing like the unified Turkish Republic we know today. The region was shaped by war, migrations, and the lingering collapse of once mighty empires. The Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, once the dominant power in central Anatolia, had weakened drastically after the devastating Mongol invasions of the previous century. In its place, a mosaic of small Turkish principalities known as beyliks had risen, each ruled by independent warlords carving out lands from the ruins of Seljuk control. Among these small domains, one of the least significant was led by a man named Osman. He ruled from a modest stronghold near the Byzantine frontier, surrounded by rugged mountains, dense forests, and contested lands. Osman was no sultan, no king. He bore only the title of bey, meaning chieftain. Yet, from this humble outpost in northwestern Anatolia, he would lay the foundation for one of the longest-lasting empires in world history. Osman's principality was centered around the town of Soothe, near the Byzantine border in the region of Bithynia. The timing and geography of his rise were crucial. The Byzantine Empire, once the grand eastern half of Rome, had been steadily shrinking for centuries. By the late 13th century, it held only a fraction of its former lands in Anatolia, and even those were poorly defended. Border towns were neglected, their garrisons weak, their people restless. These frontier zones became fertile ground for ambitious leaders like Osman. Having inherited leadership from his father, who had served as a Seljuk military commander, Osman began expanding his territory around the year 1299 through raids, alliances, and settlement. That year would later be remembered as the birth of the Ottoman Empire, though no empire yet existed. At that time, Osman's domain was still a small, tribal-based beylik. But 1299 marked the moment his authority broke free from the crumbling Seljuk court, signaling true independence. Osman's ascent was not built on warfare alone. He combined diplomacy and force with equal skill. He rewarded warriors who joined his campaigns with land and plunder, attracting a stream of Ghazis, Muslim fighters who viewed their battles against the Christian Byzantines as a sacred duty. The frontier between Christian and Muslim lands was never strictly defined by faith, yet Osman's successes drew those who saw divine purpose in his struggle. The Byzantine borderlands near his territory were particularly vulnerable, their governors isolated from Constantinople and lacking support. Osman seized this advantage, capturing villages and fortresses one by one, tightening his grip on the region. His most notable early victory came with the capture of Yenişehir, which became a new base for further expansion. What truly distinguished Osman from his contemporaries was not only his success in conquest, but his foresight in consolidation. He encouraged Turkish nomads to settle in his newly conquered lands, transforming transient victories into stable, productive communities. These settlements provided an agricultural base, a loyal population, and the framework of a lasting state. By the early 14th century, Osman's principality had grown powerful enough to challenge major Byzantine cities. He set his sights on Bursa, a rich and strategic urban center. Though he would not live to see its fall, the long siege of Bursa began under his command. This marked a turning point. It was clear Osman's ambitions had outgrown mere border skirmishes. Osman's reputation spread far beyond his frontier. By asserting independence from the fading Seljuks and pushing into Byzantine lands, he emerged as a leader of both faith and fortune, a figure who inspired religious warriors and tribal allies alike. Ottoman chroniclers would later tell of a dream Osman had in which a tree grew from his body and its branches covered the earth, a prophecy of his dynasty's greatness. Whether legend or truth, the story reflected the deep sense of destiny surrounding his rule. As Osman aged, leadership gradually passed to his son Orhan, who would continue his father's mission and shape the emerging empire. Under Orhan, Bursa finally fell in 1326, becoming the first true Ottoman capital. Osman would die around that same year, his life's work complete. He left behind not palaces or monuments, but a living legacy, a dynasty bound by unity, purpose, and faith. His small frontier principality had become a state with structure and vision, one destined to shape the world. Orhan inherited not only territory but also momentum. His reign marked the transformation of a tribal domain into an organized, expanding state. One of his first acts was to complete his father's dream, the conquest of Bursa, and from there he began crafting the instruments of governance that would define the Ottoman system. Under Orhan, the Ottomans established a standing military force for the first time, moving beyond the old tribal levies. This was the seed of the professional army that would dominate Ottoman warfare for centuries. It laid the groundwork for the Janissaries, elite infantry drawn from non-Muslim subjects, trained from youth to serve the state with unwavering loyalty. Though the full devshirme system would emerge later, the concept of a disciplined, centralized corps began here. Orhan also understood the value of diplomacy as much as the sword. He married Theodora, the daughter of John VI Cantacuzene, a Byzantine prince and future emperor. It was not a union of love but of power, an alliance born of opportunity. During the Byzantine civil wars of the 1340s, Orhan supported his father-in-law, gaining prestige and access to new territories in return. This partnership opened a new frontier, Europe. In 1352, Ottoman forces crossed the Dardanelles and captured the fortress of Chimpe on the Gallipoli Peninsula. That crossing, both strategic and symbolic, marked the Ottomans' first foothold in Europe. From there, their expansion would never turn back. The weakening Byzantine Empire had left the Balkans fragmented and unstable. Thrace, Macedonia, and other regions were ripe for conquest. Ottoman forces advanced town by town, mixing military might with careful diplomacy and strategic settlement. Turkish-speaking Muslim families were encouraged to move into conquered lands, ensuring Ottoman control and cultural influence took root. When Orhan died in the early 1360s, his son Murad I inherited a growing empire that now spanned 2 continents. Murad's reign would mark the true birth of the Ottoman imperial identity. He strengthened the standing army, formalized administration, and perfected the Janissary corps. Boys taken from Christian families in the Balkans were converted to Islam and trained in military and administrative service, creating a loyal elite who owed allegiance only to the Sultan. This devshirme system became not only a military innovation but a political one, centralizing power and weakening local aristocracies. It was the beginning of a disciplined, enduring empire that would soon stand at the gates of Europe's greatest cities. The world was changing, and so were the Ottomans. From a small frontier outpost, they had become a state of vision, discipline, and faith. And this was only the beginning. During the reign of Murad, the Ottomans achieved remarkable territorial expansion in the Balkans. Adrianople, one of Thrace's most important cities, was captured in the 1360s and soon declared the new Ottoman capital. Renamed Edirne, it became both a political and military stronghold for campaigns that pushed deeper into Europe. Yet this expansion was not without resistance. The growing Ottoman presence alarmed neighboring powers, particularly the Serbians, Bulgarians, and Hungarians. Coalitions began to form, determined to halt Ottoman advances. One of the most decisive encounters occurred in 1371 at the Battle of Maritsa, where the Ottoman forces defeated a much larger Serbian army. This victory not only showcased their growing military skill, but also shattered local resistance and reinforced their reputation for strategic brilliance. Murad's vision extended beyond conquest. He reorganized the administration of conquered territories, often allowing local rulers to remain in power under Ottoman suzerainty as long as they paid tribute and pledged loyalty. This pragmatic system allowed the empire to govern diverse populations without dismantling their local institutions entirely. It reduced rebellion, maintained stability, and ensured a steady flow of resources back to the capital. Murad also introduced a crucial change in political identity. He began using the title Sultan instead of Bey. This shift symbolized a transformation in Ottoman self-image, from a regional Anatolian power to an emerging empire with broader ambitions and legitimacy. That ambition was put to the test in 1389 at the Battle of Kosovo. There, the Ottomans, clashed with a coalition of Balkan states led by Prince Lazar of Serbia. Though the battle ended in an Ottoman victory, it came at a heavy cost. Murad himself was assassinated in the aftermath, reportedly by a Serbian soldier pretending to surrender. His death marked the first time an Ottoman sultan fell in battle. Nevertheless, the outcome solidified Ottoman dominance in the Balkans. Many Serbian nobles submitted to Ottoman rule afterward, and Kosovo became a symbol that echoed through both Ottoman and Balkan memory for centuries. Politically, it was a defining step toward Ottoman supremacy in southeastern Europe. The reigns of Orhan and Murad I were transformative. They turned the Ottomans from a small Anatolian principality into a two-continent empire renowned for its disciplined armies, wise administration, and strategic alliances. Their institutions and military reforms laid a foundation strong enough to sustain future expansion. When Sultan Murad II fell at Kosovo in 1389, his son Bayezid swiftly assumed command of the army. The transfer of power reportedly occurred on the battlefield itself to maintain unity and morale. Already a respected commander, Bayezid wasted no time in consolidating control. He soon earned the nickname Yildirim Bayezid, Bayezid the Thunderbolt, reflecting his unmatched speed in both strategy and warfare. His first priority was to secure the Balkans. He crushed resistance among the remaining Serbian lords, some of whom had fought at Kosovo, while others were incorporated into the Ottoman system through vassalage. By allowing certain Christian rulers to retain limited autonomy in exchange for tribute and military support, Bayezid ensured stability in the region before turning his attention eastward. Throughout the 1390s, Bayezid launched a series of campaigns across Anatolia, targeting rival Turkish principalities, the very beyliks that had once formed the fragmented post-Seljuk landscape. One by one, he brought Karaman, Aydin, Saruhan, Germian, and others under Ottoman rule. These were not merely conquests, they were deliberate steps toward unifying the Turkish heartland. For the first time, the Ottomans controlled vast territories across both Europe and Anatolia. Yet this unity came at a cost. Many local rulers and scholars resisted Bayezid's centralization, resenting the loss of autonomy and long-standing traditions. His militarily efficient but politically heavy-handed approach upset the fragile balance among Anatolian powers. Still, his success in the Balkans continued. He besieged Constantinople multiple times between 1394 and 1399, exploiting Byzantine weakness. Though he never captured the city, his relentless pressure demonstrated Ottoman dominance. He solidified control over Bulgaria and brought Wallachia and parts of Bosnia under Ottoman vassalage. These rapid expansions, however, drew the attention of Western Europe. Alarmed by Ottoman power, Pope Boniface IX called for a crusade. In 1396, a coalition of Hungarian, French, German, and other European forces, supported by Venetian ships, marched toward the Danube to challenge Bayezid. The armies met near Nicopolis in modern-day Bulgaria. Overconfident European knights charged recklessly uphill against a well-prepared Ottoman defense. Bayezid's disciplined tactics, his use of cavalry, infantry, and the elite janissaries, overwhelmed the Crusaders. Thousands were slain or captured, including many noblemen. Among the prisoners was Jean, son of the Duke of Burgundy, later ransomed at great cost. The defeat at Nicopolis crushed Western hopes and confirmed the Ottomans as the dominant power in southeastern Europe. Flushed with triumph, Bayezid began to see himself not only as a sultan, but as a potential caliph of the Islamic world. Though this recognition never materialized, his ambitions alarmed other Muslim rulers, especially in the East. The most formidable among them was Timur, the Central Asian conqueror who had built an empire stretching from Persia to India. Timur viewed himself as the heir to Mongol greatness and Bayezid's growing power as a direct challenge. Tensions quickly escalated. Several Anatolian beyliks that Bayezid had subdued fled to Timur for protection. Timur demanded their lands be restored. Bayezid refused. Each regarded the other as an impostor. Timur saw Bayezid as an upstart Turk threatening Mongol legacy, while Bayezid saw Timur as a foreign usurper intruding into Anatolia. In 1402, their rivalry reached its catastrophic climax at the Battle of Ankara. The two colossal armies met near Chubuk, outside Ankara. Bayezid's army was powerful and disciplined, composed of troops from both Europe and Anatolia, including his elite janissaries. But Timur's forces were larger, battle-hardened, and reinforced with war elephants from India. Crucially, some of Bayezid's Anatolian allies defected to Timur's side even before the fighting began. The battle started in Bayezid's favor, but the blazing Anatolian heat, exhaustion, and treachery soon shifted the momentum. Timur's cavalry executed sweeping maneuvers that encircled the Ottoman center. Bayezid fought valiantly, but was eventually captured, along with one of his sons. The defeat was catastrophic. The Ottoman army lay in ruins, and Bayezid became Timur's prisoner. He died less than a year later, likely from illness or despair. With the Sultan gone and the military shattered, the empire plunged into chaos. This dark chapter, known as the Ottoman Interregnum, lasted over a decade. Bayezid's sons, Suleiman, Isa, Musa, and Mehmed, each claimed the throne, plunging the empire into civil war. The central authority Bayezid had built disintegrated overnight. In Anatolia, the beyliks reasserted independence. In the Balkans, vassal states sought to break free. Even Constantinople, long under siege, briefly regained breathing space. Timur, having crushed the Ottomans, returned east without establishing control over Anatolia. No new power rose to replace the Ottomans, leaving the field open for Bayezid's surviving sons to fight for restoration. Bayezid the Thunderbolt had expanded Ottoman power to unprecedented heights, but his ambitions overreached. His centralization created resentment, his conquests provoked mighty enemies, and his fall exposed the empire's fragile dependence on one man's strength. The collapse that followed was not the end of the Ottoman story. but its first great reckoning, a test of whether an empire built by thunder could endure the silence that followed. A moment arrived when the empire could easily have fractured beyond repair, yet through resilience, careful strategy, and the ambition of a new generation, the Ottomans slowly rebuilt. The Battle of Ankara in 1402 left the Ottoman state in ruins. With Sultan Bayezid captured and later dead, the central authority that had held together the empire's diverse regions and peoples vanished. What followed was far more than a simple power vacuum. It was a civil war that threatened to destroy the Ottoman project entirely. This decade-long period is known as the Ottoman Interregnum. It was defined by fierce conflict among Bayezid's surviving sons, each determined to claim the throne and restore the empire under his own name. The empire, once unified under a strong sultan, now splintered into competing zones of influence, with Anatolia and the Balkans descending into disorder. At the heart of the crisis were Bayezid's four sons, Suleiman, Isa, Musa, and Mehmed. Each had governed parts of the empire and possessed military experience, but none held a universally recognized claim to the sultanate. Ottoman succession was not governed by law but by strength. Suleiman, the eldest, quickly established control over the European territories, setting up his court in Edirne. From there, he asserted his claim as the rightful heir, issuing coins in his name and negotiating with both Christian and Muslim rulers. His grip on the Balkans gave him access to manpower and resources, which he used to bolster his position in Anatolia. Isa attempted to seize Bursa, the former Ottoman capital, but faced resistance from local factions and his brother Mehmed, who had taken control of Amasya in eastern Anatolia. Mehmed, though initially less prominent, proved a skilled strategist. He avoided early confrontations, instead consolidating his power base and forging alliances with local Turkish lords weary of the chaos. Musa, the fourth brother, played a minor role at first, but his influence would grow as the struggle evolved. Open conflict erupted around 1413 when Mehmed and Isa clashed in western Anatolia. Mehmed defeated Isa near Ulubad, securing Bursa, while Isa fled and was later captured and executed, eliminating one rival. Mehmed emerged as the leading contender in Anatolia, while Suleiman maintained strength in the Balkans. Suleiman's forces advanced into northern Anatolia and temporarily captured Bursa, threatening Mehmed's position. However, his reliance on Christian allies and perceived arrogance alienated many Anatolian supporters. Mehmed leveraged this, presenting himself as the protector of Islamic interests and Anatolian autonomy. In 1410, Mehmed acted decisively. He sent his brother Musa across the straits into Europe to challenge Suleiman directly. Musa rallied support from dissatisfied factions in the Balkans, including former allies of Suleiman who distrusted his policies. With this backing, Musa advanced on Edirne. Suleiman attempted to defend his capital but was betrayed by key commanders. By 1411, he was captured and executed. Musa now controlled the European half of the empire, but his rule quickly became oppressive. He alienated allies through purges and strict centralization. Mehmed, who had used Musa to remove Suleiman, now faced another powerful rival. The final phase of the civil war saw two experienced brothers clash with substantial armies and territories. The decisive battle occurred in 1413 near Chamurlu, close to modern-day Sofia. Mehmed, aided by Serbian contingents and former allies of Suleiman, defeated Musa's forces. Musa fled but was hunted down and killed. With his death, Mehmed became the sole surviving son of Bayezid and the undisputed ruler of the Ottoman state. Now known as Mehmed I, he faced the enormous task of rebuilding a fractured empire. After a decade of continuous warfare, his legitimacy rested on survival and victory rather than birthright. His rule would be defined by pragmatism, reconciliation, and restoration. One of his first priorities was to re-establish administrative order. The central institutions, the treasury, bureaucracy, and judiciary, had been neglected or disrupted during the Civil War. Mehmed appointed experienced officials, restored the tax system, and ensured regional governors reported to the central authority in Edirne and Bursa. He also sought to repair relations with neighboring powers. In the Balkans, many vassal states had attempted to break away during the interregnum. Mehmed reasserted Ottoman suzerainty without excessive punishment, recognizing that long-term stability required compromise. In Anatolia, he approached the resurgent Turkish beyliks carefully, reabsorbing some through diplomacy and subduing others with limited military campaigns. Crucially, Mehmed did not pursue expansion. He understood that consolidation, not conquest, was needed. His military campaigns focused on defense and restoring core territories. Mehmed also emphasized religious legitimacy. He supported Islamic scholars and restored endowments to religious institutions, rebuilding public trust and reinforcing the Sultan's image as a just and pious ruler. By distancing himself from the civil war's divisions, he reconnected the Ottoman state to its foundational identity. Though Mehmed I ruled for only a few years after ending the interregnum, later Ottoman historiography recognized him as the restorer. He laid the groundwork for a centralized monarchy and preserved the empire at a moment when it could easily have collapsed. The Ottoman interregnum is remembered as a time of chaos, yet it also tested the resilience of the state's institutions. The survival of the empire after a decade of civil war, competing claims and territorial losses demonstrated the strength of structures built by earlier sultans and the critical role of decisive leadership. Mehmed's death in 1421 marked the end of this transitional era. He had secured the Ottoman realm, but its future now rested on his son Murad II. Murad inherited a reunited empire and the challenge of restoring its strength abroad. When Mehmed I died in 1421, his son Murad, likely in his late teens, assumed the throne. Despite his youth, he had already gained experience in provincial governance and showed promising leadership. His accession was smooth, a rare occurrence in Ottoman dynastic transitions, especially so soon after a brutal civil war. This stability owed much to Mehmed's careful consolidation of power. Murad's early reign was immediately tested in Anatolia. Several Turkish beyliks that had reasserted independence during the interregnum sought to resist Ottoman control. Murad acted decisively, launching campaigns against the Jermianids, Karamanids, and other Anatolian principalities, re-establishing Ottoman dominance. These campaigns were not merely territorial, they were vital for reinforcing the perception of sultanic authority throughout the Asian heartland. In the Balkans, instability also persisted. Many vassal states had drifted from Ottoman control or challenged supremacy during the interregnum. Serbia, Wallachia, and Albania all resisted, sometimes with support from Hungary and other European powers. The Christian states of southeastern Europe remembered the trauma of earlier Ottoman advances and saw opportunity in a weakened empire. Murad addressed these threats through both military force and careful diplomacy. In the early 1420s, he campaigned in Serbia and Wallachia, bringing them back under Ottoman vassalage. These victories, though often temporary, demonstrated the continued strength of the Ottoman state. Murad's reign also focused on administrative reform and institutional strengthening. He expanded the devshirme system, the levy of Christian boys from the Balkans, which supplied manpower for the Janissary Corps and palace bureaucracy. These boys were converted to Islam and rigorously trained, becoming some of the most loyal and capable servants of the empire. Though controversial by modern standards, the devshirme system was a cornerstone of Ottoman governance during this period. It ensured that the central government maintained direct access to a class of administrators and soldiers entirely detached from local power networks and fully dependent on the Sultan's favor. This centralization reinforced the empire's core institutions during a period when fragmented loyalties had proven perilous. Murad also invested in architecture and cultural projects. He commissioned mosques, bridges, and schools in major cities like Edirne and Bursa, strengthening both the spiritual and civic legitimacy of the dynasty. These constructions were more than displays of wealth. They were declarations of stability, demonstrating to subjects and rivals alike that the Ottomans had reclaimed their imperial identity. In 1439, the Ottomans captured Thessaloniki from the Venetians. This key Aegean port had long been contested, and its acquisition enhanced Ottoman access to maritime trade and naval operations in the region. It also signaled a renewed expansionist trajectory, particularly in Europe. The most dramatic episode of Murad's reign, however, arose in response to a new crusading effort from Europe. Alarmed by Ottoman growth, Pope Eugene IV, together with the Kingdom of Hungary and the Republic of Venice, coordinated a military campaign to halt Ottoman advances in the Balkans, culminating in the Crusade of Varna. Murad, who had briefly abdicated in favor of his son Mehmed, later known as Mehmed the Conqueror, was recalled to command the army personally. His earlier abdication in 1444 had been unusual and perhaps premature, as Mehmed was still a teenager and lacked the experience to confront such a formidable threat. The Crusader army, led by King Władysław of Poland and Hungary and John Hunyadi, advanced confidently into Ottoman territory. Murad returned to lead the Ottoman forces confronting the Crusaders at the Battle of Varna on 10 November 1444. The engagement was fierce, but the Ottomans ultimately prevailed. King Władysław was killed, and the Crusader forces suffered a decisive defeat. This victory reaffirmed Ottoman military dominance and extinguished immediate European hopes of reversing Ottoman presence in the Balkans. After Varna, Murad resumed control of the empire despite his brief abdication. His return heralded renewed stability, though unrest persisted, particularly in Albania, where the local leader, Skanderbeg, waged a protracted rebellion with Western backing. While this insurgency tied down Ottoman resources, it did not halt the empire's overall momentum. Murad's later years emphasized administrative refinement over territorial conquest. He professionalized the bureaucracy, streamlined tax collection, and regulated land grants to military elites, reforms that would have enduring effects on governance across a growing and diverse empire. Murad II died in 1451, concluding a reign spanning 3 decades, a period of both recovery and redefinition for the Ottoman state. He had navigated the aftermath of civil war, reclaimed lost territories, defeated a major crusading army, and handed a revitalized empire to his son. In the spring of 1453, one of history's defining moments occurred: the fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans. This event marked not only the end of the Byzantine Empire, but also the transformation of the Ottomans into a true imperial power, with a capital at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. For centuries, Constantinople had symbolized Christian resilience and Eastern Roman continuity. Its capture by Sultan Mehmed II, thereafter called the Conqueror, reverberated across the Christian and Islamic worlds. When Murad II died in 1451, his son Mehmed inherited a strong, unified empire. Unlike his youthful predecessor, this Mehmed was a determined, highly educated ruler, versed in military strategy, classical philosophy, and Islamic jurisprudence. Fluent in Arabic, Persian, Greek, and Latin, he combined ambition with intellectual depth. From the outset of his reign, he made clear his objective: to achieve what generations of Muslim rulers had failed to do: conquer Constantinople. By then, the Byzantine Empire was a shadow of its former self. Confined mainly to Constantinople and a few surrounding territories, Emperor Constantine II Palaiologos governed a shrinking population with limited financial and military resources. Though the city's walls remained formidable, they were undermanned and vulnerable to emerging siege technologies. Mehmed immediately began siege preparations. Understanding that manpower alone would not suffice, he invested in military engineering, commissioning massive bombards capable of breaching the walls. The most famous, built by Hungarian engineer Orban, had initially sought employment with the Byzantines, who lacked funds, and was thus recruited by the Ottomans. Mehmed also isolated Constantinople diplomatically and strategically, ordering in 1452 the construction of the fortress Rumeli Hisar on the European side of the Bosporus, directly opposite Anadolu Hisar, effectively blocking northern maritime aid. By early April 1453, Mehmed's army, numbering tens of thousands, encircled Constantinople. It included elite janissaries, artillery units, cavalry, and naval support. The defenders numbered only a few thousand, supplemented by Genoese and Venetian volunteers, notably Giovanni Giustiniani, who organized the city's defenses. The siege began on the 6th April. For over 6 weeks, the Ottomans bombarded the walls continuously. Orban's massive cannon could fire only a few times daily, but inflicted significant damage over time. Defenders worked tirelessly to repair breaches, leveraging Constantinople's triple-layered walls built under Theodosius II, which had resisted numerous sieges over centuries. Mehmed, demonstrating both ingenuity and persistence, ordered his forces to haul ships overland using greased logs, bypassing the chain boom blocking the Golden Horn. By launching troops and artillery from this unexpected position, he attacked the city from a new direction, catching defenders off guard. As the siege progressed, morale inside Constantinople deteriorated. Supplies dwindled, and aid from Western Europe, despite papal calls, never arrived in meaningful force due to religious and political divisions. On the night of 28th May, Emperor Constantine X reportedly led a final service in Hagia Sophia, uniting citizens of all Christian denominations in prayer. In the early hours of 29th May, the Ottomans launched their final assault. Waves of soldiers struck the walls. Despite fierce resistance and the wounding of Giustiniani, defenders could not hold. A small Ottoman unit breached a lightly guarded gate, overwhelming the remaining defenders. Emperor Constantine V died fighting, his exact fate uncertain, though accounts suggest he discarded his imperial regalia and charged as a common soldier, marking the symbolic end of the Byzantine Empire. Following the conquest, Constantinople was briefly looted, but Mehmed quickly restored order. He entered the city triumphantly and converted Hagia Sophia into a mosque, symbolically transforming Constantinople from a Christian capital into the heart of a Muslim empire. Mehmed took deliberate steps to preserve infrastructure and repopulate the city, inviting Muslims, Christians, and Jews to settle there, offering incentives for migration and reconstruction. He established a new administrative system and initiated construction projects to restore and enhance the city's grandeur. Mehmed also adopted the title Caesar of Rome, asserting the Ottomans' claim to the legacy of the Eastern Roman Empire. This reflected not only symbolic authority, but also his ambition to position the Ottomans as heirs to classical imperial legitimacy. Constantinople, commonly called Istanbul, now served as the capital of a global empire. The fall of Constantinople had profound geopolitical repercussions. In the Christian world, it was perceived as a calamity and a warning. Western European leaders feared further Ottoman advances, while the Islamic world celebrated the conquest as a long-anticipated triumph. For Mehmed II and the Ottoman state, the capture of Constantinople marked the beginning of a new chapter. The empire had entered a fully imperial phase with a permanent capital, centralized bureaucracy, and a ruler with global ambitions. The question was no longer whether the Ottomans could survive, but how far they could expand, a question that Mehmed would answer over the following decades through campaigns across Europe and Asia. Following the dramatic conquest of Constantinople in 1453, Sultan Mehmed II embarked on building not just a new capital, but an empire deserving of global recognition. While the fall of the Byzantine capital delivered a symbolic and strategic triumph, Mehmed understood that a single victory did not guarantee lasting imperial authority. It would require administrative innovation, legal reform, and ongoing military expansion to transform the Ottoman state into a durable empire. From the very start of his post-conquest reign, Mehmed focused on centralization. He aimed to curtail the power of provincial governors and local notables who had previously wielded significant autonomy. One of his most important administrative reforms was the restructuring of the Timar system. This system, based on land grants given to military officers in exchange for service, had long underpinned Ottoman governance. Mehmed ensured that these lands remained under state ownership and could not be inherited, preventing the rise of a landed aristocracy capable of challenging the sultan's authority. He also expanded the role of the imperial bureaucracy. Under his leadership, the Divan, the Council of Ministers, became more efficient and influential. Mehmed appointed skilled viziers from diverse backgrounds, including those trained through the Devshirme system. These administrators, taken as boys from Christian families, converted to Islam, and educated in state service, formed a loyal and capable elite. They had no independent power bases and owed their positions entirely to the Sultan, further reinforcing central authority. Perhaps Mehmed's most enduring contribution was his legal reform. While Islamic law, or Sharia, remained the foundation, he issued a codified body of secular laws known as the Kanun-i Ali Osman, the law code of the House of Osman. This code addressed administrative procedures, taxation, criminal law, and property rights. The Kanun complemented Sharia, filling legal gaps and ensuring uniformity across the empire. This dual system of religious and sultanic law became a hallmark of Ottoman governance for centuries. Mehmed also revitalized Constantinople as a cosmopolitan imperial capital. After the conquest, the city had been partially depopulated and suffered from decades of decline. He ordered the construction of markets, baths, mosques, and palaces, inviting Muslims, Christians, and Jews from across the empire to settle there. Through forced relocation policies, known as sürgün, populations from other Ottoman regions were resettled in the capital, restoring its vibrancy and demographic diversity. Among Mehmed's architectural achievements was the Topkapi Palace, which served as the primary residence and administrative hub for Ottoman sultans for centuries. The complex combined luxury with functionality, housing the sultan's private quarters, council chambers, treasury, and archives, symbolizing and operationalizing absolute authority. Beyond the city, Mehmed pursued ambitious territorial expansion. In the Balkans, he consolidated control through campaigns in Serbia, Bosnia, and Albania, capturing key fortresses and integrating these regions into the empire. Resistance, particularly under Albanian leader Skanderbeg, remained fierce, but Mehmed's campaigns gradually subdued opposition. In Anatolia, he reasserted control over rival Turkish principalities, notably the Karamanids, solidifying Ottoman authority across central Anatolia. This was both a strategic and ideological effort, as Mehmed positioned himself as the rightful heir to the Seljuks and, by extension, the legitimate ruler of all Anatolian Turks. Mehmed's ambitions extended beyond local domains. He launched naval expeditions into the Black Sea, seizing ports in Crimea and asserting control over key trade routes. The Genoese colony of Kaffa and the Crimean Khanate became Ottoman vassals, expanding naval capacity and Ottoman influence in the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean. He also targeted Latin Christian enclaves and remaining Crusader states. In 1460, Ottoman forces captured the Duchy of Athens, gradually subjugating the Peloponnese over the following decades. In 1461, he ended the empire of Trebizond, the last significant Byzantine successor state, extinguishing Eastern Roman political authority. Throughout his reign, Mehmed displayed a keen interest in Renaissance thought and classical learning. He maintained a court of scholars, poets, artists, and historians from diverse backgrounds, commissioning translations of Greek and Latin works into Turkish and keeping classical texts in his personal library. His intellectual curiosity contrasted with the narrow medieval stereotype of rulers and reflected a cosmopolitan vision of empire. Yet Mehmed ruled with a firm hand. He suppressed revolts decisively and kept the Janissary corps under tight control, executing officials or commanders who showed disloyalty. His governance was rooted in the belief that imperial unity and central authority were absolute. By his death in 1481, Mehmed had transformed the Ottoman state from a regional power into a centralized, multi-ethnic and multi-religious empire. He established Istanbul as a global capital, reformed laws and administration, and expanded territory across 3 continents. His legacy was profound, and later Ottoman rulers looked to him as a model of military prowess, legal innovation, cultural openness, and administrative control. His passing, however, raised questions about succession, stability, and the empire's future direction. His son, Bayezid II, inherited a vastly more complex and demanding empire. Following Mehmed's death, the Ottoman Empire entered a period of political transition that would shape the next generation of rulers. Bayezid faced not only the challenge of governing an expanded state, but also the responsibility of upholding the dual legacy of Islamic and Roman imperial traditions. The succession was contested. Upon Mehmed's death, a struggle emerged between his 2 sons, Bayezid, the elder, who governed Amasya, and Cem, the younger, who ruled Karaman. Cem, ambitious and charismatic with his own network of supporters, raced for Constantinople but was outpaced by Bayezid, who, with the backing of influential statesmen and the Janissaries, reached the capital first and was proclaimed Sultan. Refusing to concede, Cem rebelled in central Anatolia. In 1481, he declared himself Sultan in Bursa, sparking a brief but intense civil war. Bayezid defeated him near the town of Yeni Shehir, forcing Cem to flee. Seeking refuge, Cem entered the domain of the Knights Hospitaller on the island of Rhodes, and later came under papal custody in Rome. For the next 15 years, Cem remained a political pawn for European powers seeking leverage against the Ottomans. Bayezid paid substantial sums to ensure his brother remained captive and could not foment rebellion within the empire. This early conflict highlighted one of Bayezid's main challenges: maintaining unity within an increasingly diverse and politically complex state. Unlike his father, who pursued aggressive expansion, Bayezid prioritized stability, religious orthodoxy, and cautious diplomacy. His reign emphasized consolidation rather than conquest. Domestically, Bayezid invested heavily in infrastructure and religious institutions. He commissioned mosques, schools, bridges, and public fountains, particularly in Istanbul and Edirne, reflecting his piety and commitment to Islamic tradition. He also supported scholars and religious leaders, reinforcing Sunni orthodoxy and integrating newly acquired territories through religious and educational institutions. One of the most defining humanitarian acts of Bayezid's reign came in response to events in Spain. In 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella completed the Reconquista, expelling Muslims and Jews from the Iberian Peninsula. Bayezid ordered the Ottoman navy to aid in the relocation of Sephardic Jews, welcoming them into Ottoman cities such as Salonika and Istanbul, where they became integral to commerce and intellectual life. This policy of religious tolerance, particularly toward Jews, contrasted sharply with the growing sectarian strife in Western Europe. However, tolerance had its limits. In Anatolia, a new ideological and military threat emerged from the east, the Safavid movement in Persia. Originally a Sufi order, the Safavids had transformed under Shah Ismail into a militant Shia dynasty, signaling future challenges to Ottoman authority in the region. By the early 15th century, the Safavids had begun consolidating power in Persia, presenting a direct ideological and political challenge to the Sunni Ottoman Empire. Shah Ismail, claiming descent from Ali, rapidly expanded his territory and declared Shia Islam the official religion of the Safavid state. This shift had serious consequences for the Ottomans in eastern Anatolia. Numerous Turkic tribes, known as the Kizilbash for their distinctive red headgear, embraced Shia doctrines and challenged Ottoman authority. Bayezid viewed this movement with concern but approached it cautiously. suppressing local uprisings quietly and closely monitoring the eastern frontier. However, his cautious approach was not universally accepted by the Ottoman elite. Some military leaders and scholars of the ulama urged decisive action, warning that Safavid influence among Anatolian tribes could destabilize the empire. Bayezid's reluctance to confront the Safavids more aggressively created tensions that would later escalate after his reign. Externally, Bayezid faced ongoing conflicts with European powers, particularly Venice, naval skirmishes in the eastern Mediterranean, disputes over trade routes, and territorial disputes defined the intermittent Ottoman-Venetian War of the late 15th century. The conflict concluded with the Treaty of Constantinople in 1502, granting some territories to the Ottomans while Venice retained others, maintaining a delicate Mediterranean balance. In the Balkans, Bayezid continued his father's policy of maintaining vassal states and applying military pressure selectively. He reasserted control in Wallachia and Bosnia, preserving relative peace through treaties and dynastic marriages. He avoided major territorial expansion in Europe, concentrating instead on consolidating authority over existing provinces. Despite this generally cautious stance, Bayezid's final years were marked by increasing instability. A succession crisis emerged among his sons, particularly Ahmed and Cem. Ahmed, the elder, enjoyed court support, while Cem, more ambitious and militaristic, sought to assert his claim by force. As governor of Trabzon on the eastern frontier, Cem had long criticized his father's leniency toward the Safavids. In the early 16th century, Cem gathered support among frontier troops and advanced into Thrace in 1510, demanding recognition as heir. Bayezid attempted mediation but failed to prevent conflict. By 1511, Cem's forces defeated Ahmed's, forcing Bayezid to abdicate. He left Istanbul and died shortly after in 1512. Cem's accession marked the beginning of a more aggressive phase in Ottoman history. Bayezid II is remembered for piety, moderation, and relative peace. He prioritized internal stability, religious scholarship, and social welfare. But his caution toward the growing Safavid threat and indecision over succession left unresolved tensions for his successor. The rise of Selim, I would resolve these divisions with ruthless efficiency, dramatically expand the empire, and establish Ottoman supremacy in the Islamic world. When Selim ascended the throne in 1512, he inherited a stable but cautious empire. His father, Bayezid II, had emphasized order and avoided direct confrontation with emerging external threats. Selim, by contrast, had no interest in restraint. A seasoned military leader hardened by years on the eastern frontier, he carried a vision of Ottoman supremacy demanding confrontation, especially with the Safavids in Persia and the Mamluks in Egypt. Known as Selim the Grim, or Yavuz Sultan Selim in Turkish, he was austere, disciplined, and deeply ambitious. From the outset, he regarded the Safavid Empire under Shah Ismail as the foremost threat to Ottoman security and legitimacy. While prior sultans had tolerated or cautiously managed Shia influence in Anatolia, Selim saw it as a direct challenge to the Sunni foundations of the empire. By this time, the Safavid dynasty had evolved from a Sufi order into a powerful Shia theocracy. Shah Ismail united Persian and Turkic tribes under the banner of Twelver Shi'ism and expanded westward into Ottoman-influenced territories. His ideological appeal resonated among Anatolian populations, particularly the Kizilbash, who rejected Ottoman authority and recognized Ismail as their spiritual leader. Selim acted swiftly and uncompromisingly. One of his first actions was a brutal purge of suspected Safavid sympathizers within Ottoman lands, with thousands arrested or executed, especially in eastern provinces. Securing his rear, Selim then marched east with a well-organized and modernized army, culminating in the Battle of Chaldiran in 1514, a decisive confrontation that would shape the regional balance for generations. The armies clashed on the plains near Chaldiran in present-day Iran. Although the Safavid forces were numerous and motivated by religious zeal, they were poorly equipped to withstand the disciplined Ottoman infantry, heavy artillery, and organized logistics. Ottoman superiority, particularly their use of cannons and musket-armed janissaries, proved decisive. Safavid cavalry charges, formidable in close combat, faltered against Ottoman firepower. Shah Ismail was wounded and narrowly escaped, while his army was shattered. The Ottomans captured valuable territory, including the Safavid capital of Tabriz, though they did not permanently occupy it. The victory at Chaldiran was not merely military, it was an ideological blow. Shah Ismail's claim to divine invincibility, central to his religious and political legitimacy, was shattered. For the Ottomans, the triumph secured dominance in eastern Anatolia and affirmed leadership of the Sunni Islamic world. Selim's campaign reasserted control over contested regions and weakened Safavid influence among Anatolian tribes. After consolidating the east, Selim turned to the Mamluk domains in the Arab lands. The Mamluk Sultanate, based in Cairo, controlled Egypt, Syria, and the Hijaz. Though fellow Muslims and nominally Sunni, Mamluk-Ottoman relations were strained by economic rivalry, trade disputes, and competition for regional influence. Significantly, the Mamluks held spiritual authority over Mecca and Medina, maintaining a ceremonial claim to the caliphate. For Selim, who had subdued the Shia Safavids, uniting Islamic lands under Ottoman rule was both a political and religious objective. Despite Mamluk military strength, outdated tactics and internal divisions left them vulnerable. In 1516, Selim launched his campaign into Syria, winning a decisive victory at the Battle of Majd-Dabik near Aleppo. The Mamluk Sultan, Al-Ashraf Qansuh al-Gawri, was killed, and Syria fell under Ottoman control. Selim pressed on into Egypt. In 1517, he defeated the last Mamluk Sultan, Tuman Bey, at the Battle of Ridania near Cairo. The Mamluk Sultanate was dismantled and Egypt was incorporated into the Ottoman Empire. Selim entered Cairo triumphantly, instituting Ottoman governance while retaining some Mamluk administrative structures to ease the transition. The conquest of Egypt and the Levant was among the most significant territorial gains in Ottoman history. It gave the Ottomans control of key cities, including Damascus, Jerusalem, and Cairo, secured the Red Sea and Western Arabian Peninsula, and opened access to Indian Ocean trade routes. Most importantly, the Ottomans assumed symbolic leadership of the Muslim world. Following the fall of the Mamluks, Selim claimed custodianship of the two holy cities and, according to tradition, received the caliphal title from the last Abbasid caliph in Cairo. While the precise historical details are debated, the Ottoman claim to both political and spiritual authority over much of the Muslim world was established. Selim returned to Istanbul in triumph. Though his reign lasted less than a decade, its impact was profound. He doubled the empire's territory, subdued its ideological rival, and asserted leadership over the global Muslim community. Administrative integration followed, with new provinces organized, taxes standardized, and garrisons established. Yet Selim's rule was marked by authoritarianism and intolerance for dissent. Internal purges, particularly targeting suspected religious subversives, created long-lasting resentment, though his emphasis on centralization and orthodoxy ensured imperial unity. Selim died unexpectedly in 1520, likely from illness while preparing for further campaigns, possibly against Rhodes or deeper into Europe. He was buried in Istanbul, where his tomb and mosque remain symbols of his powerful legacy. Upon his death, his son Suleiman ascended the Ottoman throne. Few could have predicted the extraordinary transformation the empire would undergo under his rule. Over the next 46 years, Suleiman would lead the Ottomans to the peak of territorial, political, legal, and cultural power. Known as Suleiman the Lawgiver in the Islamic world and Suleiman the Magnificent in Europe, his reign marked the classical pinnacle of the Ottoman Empire. During this era, Istanbul rivaled any capital on earth, and Ottoman influence extended from Vienna's gates to the deserts of Arabia. Suleiman ascended as a young, well-prepared ruler. Educated in the palace system, he had governed several provinces, including Manisa, where future sultans were trained in administration and military leadership. Unlike his father, who ruled with severity and suspicion, Suleiman was cultured, articulate, and deeply intellectually curious. He spoke multiple languages fluently, including Turkish, Arabic, Persian, and several European tongues. Writing poetry under the pen name Muhibi, he surrounded himself with scholars, artists, and legal thinkers, cultivating a vibrant court of intellect and creativity. Suleiman's early years on the throne were marked by decisive and ambitious military campaigns. In 1521, the Ottomans invaded Hungary, capturing Belgrade, a major Christian fortress on the Danube. This was a calculated strike, as Belgrade had resisted Mehmed II decades earlier. Its fall signaled that Ottoman expansion into Central Europe was no longer speculative. It was inevitable. Turning to the Eastern Mediterranean, Suleiman launched a campaign in 1522 against the island of Rhodes, held by the Knights Hospitaller. The siege was prolonged and brutal, but ultimately the Knights surrendered. Suleiman permitted their evacuation to Malta, a rare act of magnanimity that enhanced his international reputation. The conquest secured Ottoman control over key maritime routes and removed a persistent naval threat to Anatolia. Suleiman's most consequential European campaign occurred in 1526, following the death of Hungarian King Louis II at the Battle of Mohatz. With the king drowned and Hungarian defences in disarray, Suleiman decisively defeated their forces. Ottoman artillery and Janissary infantry devastated the Hungarians within hours, allowing Suleiman to occupy Buda, the Hungarian capital. This victory created a power vacuum, sparking a dynastic and political struggle between the Habsburgs and the Ottomans. Archduke Ferdinand, brother of Holy Roman Emperor Charles XIII, claimed the Hungarian crown, setting the stage for decades of conflict. In 1529, Suleiman laid siege to Vienna, the symbolic heart of Habsburg power. Though the siege failed due to logistics, weather, and fortifications, the attempt shocked Europe. No Muslim army had penetrated so far into Central Europe. While Vienna remained uncaptured, the siege reinforced Ottoman prestige and secured their central role in European strategic calculations. While campaigning in Europe, Suleiman remained attentive to the east. The Safavid dynasty in Persia, now under Shah Tahmasp, continued to challenge Ottoman control over eastern Anatolia and Mesopotamia. Suleiman launched campaigns in the 1530s and 1550s to curb Safavid influence. Although these efforts did not produce permanent conquests comparable to his European campaigns, they secured Ottoman dominance over Baghdad and much of Iraq, expanding influence in the Arab world. Suleiman also oversaw major naval expansion. Under Admiral Hayreddin Barbarossa, the Ottomans emerged as the dominant maritime power in the Mediterranean. Victories, such as the Battle of Preveza in 1538, secured Ottoman control over eastern and central Mediterranean waters, countering Habsburg and Spanish fleets. The navy extended operations into the Red Sea, Arabian Sea, and threatened Portuguese positions along India and East Africa's coasts. At home, Suleiman is celebrated for his legal and administrative reforms. He earned the title Kanuni, the lawgiver, for his efforts to codify and harmonize Ottoman laws. While Islamic Sharia remained the legal backbone, he issued extensive secular regulations covering taxation, land ownership, criminal justice, and commerce. These codifications created uniformity, reinforced state authority, and promoted fairness, earning respect even among non-Muslim subjects. Suleiman's court reflected the cultural and intellectual flowering of his era. The architectural genius Mimar Sinan transformed Istanbul's skyline, designing over 300 structures, including mosques, bridges, aqueducts, and schools. His masterpiece, the Süleymaniye Mosque, epitomizes the grandeur and sophistication of the period. Suleiman's inner circle included key figures such as Grand Vizier Pargalı Ibrahim Pasha and his wife Hürrem Sultan. Hürrem, formerly a concubine of Ruthenian origin, became Suleiman's legal wife, a departure from tradition wielding significant influence in domestic and foreign affairs. Their partnership initiated what historians later called the Sultanate of Women, a period in which royal consorts and mothers held substantial sway in governance. Later in his reign, dynastic tension increased. His sons, born of different mothers, competed for power and favor. Mustafa, the most promising and popular, was executed on suspicion of treason, likely due to court intrigue involving Hürrem and her faction. Bayezid was later defeated and executed after rebelling against the heir apparent, Selim. Despite these tragedies, Suleiman remained on the throne until his death in 1566. Passing away during a campaign in Hungary, his death was initially concealed to prevent unrest, and he was buried in Istanbul beside the mosque bearing his name. By the end of Suleiman's reign, the Ottoman Empire had reached its greatest territorial extent, stretching from Vienna's gates to the Persian Gulf, from the Crimean steppes to the deserts of Arabia and North Africa's shores. It was a military, political, and cultural superpower with a centralized bureaucracy, a diversified economy, and a sophisticated legal framework. With Suleiman the Magnificent's death in 1566, the empire had reached the height of territorial, cultural, and administrative achievement, yet his successors faced a period of uneven transition. Dynastic struggles, military overreach, economic challenges, and internal instability increasingly marked Ottoman governance. Selim II, Suleiman's son with Hürrem Sultan, ascended in 1566. Unlike his father, he showed little interest in military campaigns or direct governance. His personal indulgences, including heavy drinking, earned him the nickname Selim the Sot. Nevertheless, the imperial machinery continued to function, though real power shifted increasingly to the Grand Vizier and court officials. Under Selim, Grand Vizier Sokollu Mehmed Pasha, an experienced statesman, maintained continuity. He oversaw ambitious projects, including canal construction and naval expansion, and even attempted to influence succession politics in the Russian Tsardom, though unsuccessfully. The most notable military event during Selim's reign was the conquest of Cyprus in 1571, then under Venetian control and a strategic Mediterranean base. However, later that year, a coalition of Catholic maritime powers, Spain, the Papal States, and Venice, formed the Holy League and confronted the Ottoman fleet at the Battle of Lepanto in the Gulf of Patras. The Ottomans suffered a crushing defeat. Dozens of ships were destroyed and tens of thousands of sailors killed or captured. Although the fleet was rebuilt, the psychological blow was severe. Lepanto marked the first major Ottoman naval defeat in over a century. Selim died in 1574, and the throne passed to his son Murad III. Under Murad, the empire continued to expand but also began showing signs of deepening dysfunction. The court was increasingly dominated by harem politics, particularly the influence of his mother, Nurbanu Sultan, and later his consort, Safiye Sultan. These royal women wielded significant political influence during what became known as the Sultanate of Women, a defining feature of late 16th and early 17th century governance. Murad oversaw military campaigns in the Caucasus and along the Austrian frontier, but his reign faced economic strain and rising corruption. Inflation, partly driven by the influx of New World silver into Europe, destabilized the monetary system, while tax collection grew inefficient. Provincial revolts erupted, especially in Anatolia, where soldiers and peasants rose against local governors. Under Mehmed III, who ascended in 1595, dynastic paranoia intensified. He ordered the execution of 19 brothers and half-brothers, a brutal consolidation reflecting growing palace insecurity. Though fratricide was not new, this act shocked contemporaries and symbolized the deadly stakes of Ottoman court politics. Mehmed III's reign was dominated by the long Turkish war against the Habsburgs in Hungary and Transylvania. Beginning in 1593 and lasting until 1606, the conflict drained Ottoman resources and exposed the limits of its military and logistical capabilities. Though the Ottomans captured several fortresses and territories, the conflict ultimately ended in stalemate with the Treaty of Zitvatorog. Signed in 1664, this treaty marked a symbolic turning point in Ottoman-Habsburg relations. For the first time, the Habsburg Emperor was recognized as an equal sovereign, ending the long-standing Ottoman claim to supremacy. Meanwhile, the empire faced renewed challenges in the east. By the late 16th century, the Safavid Empire under Shah Abbas the Great began regaining strength. Although direct confrontation with the Safavids would not peak until later decades, the Ottomans now contended with a two-front struggle: military exhaustion in the west and the resurgence of a rival power in the east. This period of instability was worsened by social unrest and the emergence of the Salali revolts. These widespread uprisings across Anatolia were led by disgruntled soldiers, bandits, and former provincial officials. Economic hardship, abuse by local authorities, and declining central control fueled the revolts. At their height, the Salali uprisings disrupted trade, agriculture, and governance throughout the Anatolian heartland. In response, the imperial court increasingly relied on the janissaries and palace elites. Once an elite military unit, the Janissary Corps had grown into a politically powerful force with vested interests in court affairs. Their salaries consumed a growing portion of the state budget, and their interference in succession politics became increasingly evident. The reign of Ahmed I, beginning in 1603, offered a moment of partial recovery. Though young when he ascended the throne, Ahmed ended the practice of royal fratricide, instead confining potential rivals to a section of the palace known as the cafes, or cage. This system, based on seniority rather than violent survival, brought a measure of stability but also meant that future sultans gained the throne with little experience, having spent most of their lives in isolation. Ahmed is best remembered for commissioning the Blue Mosque in Istanbul, an architectural masterpiece that stood as a symbol of religious devotion and imperial grandeur during a period of uncertainty. His successors, including Mustafa I and Osman II, struggled to assert authority amid palace intrigue and Janissary influence. Osman II attempted to reform the Janissary Corps and assert greater personal control, but his efforts backfired. In 1622, he was overthrown and killed by his own soldiers, becoming the first Ottoman sultan murdered by his troops. The empire entered another period of turbulence until the accession of Murad IV in 1623. Though initially a figurehead, Murad gradually consolidated power. His reign was characterized by authoritarian rule and military revival. Murad banned alcohol, tobacco, and coffee in Istanbul, enforced strict public discipline, and conducted surprise patrols to ensure compliance. His harsh measures were intended to restore order in a state plagued by disorder and moral decay. Militarily, Murad achieved a major victory by retaking Baghdad from the Safavids in 1639, restoring Ottoman dominance over much of Mesopotamia and bolstering the Sultan's reputation. His reign marked the end of a prolonged period of stagnation and internal strife, though his heavy-handed methods and sudden death in 1640 left no mechanism for sustainable reform. By the mid-17th century, the Ottoman Empire stood at a crossroads. It remained vast and powerful, stretching from the Balkans to the Red Sea and from the Tigris River to the gates of Vienna. Yet beneath this impressive facade, cracks had begun to emerge. Prolonged wars, economic turbulence, corruption, and weakening sultanic authority eroded the efficiency and cohesion of the imperial administration. The memory of Suleiman's golden age lingered, but the challenges of the present demanded decisive leadership. That leadership came not from the Sultan himself, but from a new line of reform-minded officials known as the Köprülü family. The Köprülü era began in 1656 when Köprülü Mehmed Pasha was appointed Grand Vizier by Sultan Mehmed IV. Mehmed Wayt had ascended the throne as a child, and though his reign was one of the longest in Ottoman history, it was characterized more by delegation than personal rule. Recognizing the need for strong leadership to rescue the empire from mounting chaos, the Sultan granted Köprülü Mehmed Pasha extraordinary authority, marking the beginning of a transformative period in Ottoman governance. Already an experienced and disciplined administrator, Mehmed Pasha prioritized re-establishing central authority by rooting out corruption, streamlining state finances, and reinforcing military discipline. He purged inefficient or disloyal officials, dismissing or executing abusive provincial governors, and replacing exploitative tax farmers with accountable alternatives. In Istanbul, he restored order by confronting the Janissaries and silencing rebellious elements within the palace. Unlike previous viziers who hesitated to challenge entrenched interests, Köprülü governed with firm resolve. His actions earned both fear and respect, and most importantly, restored a measure of control to the imperial center. The Köprülü reforms coincided with renewed external conflict. One of the first major challenges was the ongoing war with Venice over Crete, which had begun in the 1640s and dragged on for decades. Though the Ottomans captured much of Crete early on, the Venetian stronghold of Candia, modern-day Heraklion, held out stubbornly. Köprülü Mehmed Pasha restructured the campaign, redirected resources to the siege, and laid the groundwork for its eventual conclusion. After Mehmed Pasha's death in 1661, his son Köprülü Fazıl Ahmed Pasha continued his legacy. Fazıl Ahmed expanded his father's policies, professionalized the army, increased revenue through more efficient taxation, and led successful military campaigns. In 1669, the long and exhausting siege of Candia ended with Ottoman victory. Venice surrendered the fortress, marking the end of the war and cementing Ottoman naval dominance in the eastern Mediterranean. The fall of Candia was more than a military triumph. It symbolized the empire's restored capacity to project power and sustain prolonged operations. The Köprülü viziers also turned their attention to Central Europe. Under Fazıl Ahmed's leadership, the Ottomans launched campaigns into Hungary and Transylvania, capturing key fortresses and asserting pressure on the Habsburg monarchy. These campaigns sought to regain the initiative in Europe, where the balance of power had begun shifting away from the Ottomans. The third major Köprülü figure was Kara Mustafa Pasha, the adopted son and son-in-law of the Köprülü family. Appointed Grand Vizier in 1676, Kara Mustafa inherited the momentum of his predecessors and sought a decisive victory that would cement Ottoman dominance in Europe. His ambitions culminated in the Second Siege of Vienna. By the late 1670s, the Ottomans had allied with Imre Thököly, a Hungarian noble opposing Habsburg rule. With this alliance, Kara Mustafa mobilized a large army and marched on Vienna in 1683. The city had long been a symbolic target since Suleiman the Magnificent's failed siege over a century earlier. Capturing Vienna promised a decisive blow to Habsburg power and would restore Ottoman military prestige. The siege began in the summer of 1683 with Ottoman forces surrounding the city, bombarding it, and constructing elaborate trenches. Despite early gains, the defenders, led by Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg, mounted a tenacious resistance. Supplies held longer than expected, and the Ottomans failed to breach the inner fortifications. Crucially, a massive relief force led by Polish King John III Sobieski arrived in September. Composed of Polish, Austrian, and German troops, this army launched a surprise attack on the Ottoman camp. In the ensuing Battle of Vienna, the Ottomans were decisively defeated. Relief forces overwhelmed Ottoman lines, forcing Kara Mustafa to retreat in disarray. Thousands of soldiers were lost, and the campaign ended in humiliation. The consequences were immediate and far-reaching. Upon his return, Kara Mustafa was executed on the Sultan's orders to appease public outrage and restore confidence in the state. Yet the damage was done. The defeat at Vienna shattered the aura of Ottoman invincibility in Europe and emboldened the Habsburgs and their allies to take the offensive. In the years that followed, the Ottomans suffered a series of defeats in the Great Turkish War, also known as the War of the Holy League. A coalition of European powers, including Austria, Poland, Venice, and Russia, launched coordinated attacks on Ottoman holdings in the Balkans and Black Sea regions. Key cities such as Buda and Belgrade changed hands, and Ottoman control in Hungary steadily eroded. By the end of the 17th century, the Ottomans were compelled to accept the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699. This treaty marked a turning point in Ottoman-European relations, with the empire ceding substantial European territory, most notably Hungary and Transylvania, to the Habsburgs. It also acknowledged the growing power of Russia in the north and Venice in the Adriatic. Despite these setbacks, the Köprülü era had achieved significant internal reforms and temporarily revitalized the empire's military. Centralized control exercised by strong viziers brought stability and restored public confidence in governance. Yet the limits of this revival were exposed by the defeats of the late 17th century. The failed siege of Vienna in 1683 represented a decisive turning point in the military and geopolitical fortunes of the Ottoman Empire. Once able to dictate engagements across 3 continents, the Ottomans now faced a shifting balance of power and a more challenging European landscape. European coalitions driven by religious solidarity, imperial ambition, and improved military coordination had begun to push back against Ottoman expansion. By the late 17th century, the Ottomans found themselves retreating and negotiating peace from positions of weakness for the first time in their history. The failed siege of Vienna, led by Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, had been motivated by a mixture of ambition and overconfidence. The decision to attack the city was both strategic and symbolic. Vienna represented the heart of Habsburg power and had long been an Ottoman target since the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent. Its capture would have opened the path deeper into Central Europe, but the siege's failure shattered not only military momentum but also political confidence in Istanbul. Kara Mustafa was executed on the Sultan's orders shortly after returning, a move meant to assign blame and restore stability, but one that did little to reverse the consequences of the disaster. What followed was a prolonged conflict known as the Great Turkish War, or the War of the Holy League. In response to the Ottoman offensive at Vienna, the Habsburgs formed a coalition with Poland, Lithuania, Venice, and Russia. Under the blessing of Pope Innocent II, the war lasted over a decade, representing a sustained effort by Christian Europe to push the Ottomans out of Central and Southeastern Europe. Emboldened by their success at Vienna, the Habsburgs launched counteroffensives into Hungary. By 1686, Buda, the capital of Ottoman Hungary, fell to Habsburg forces after a bloody siege. The loss of Buda was both a psychological and strategic blow. For over 150 years, it had served as the administrative center of Ottoman authority in Central Europe. Its capture signaled not merely the loss of a city, but the unraveling of Ottoman control across the region. One by one, Ottoman fortresses along the Danube and in the Balkans fell. Habsburg forces, reorganized and better supplied, began to outperform Ottoman armies in field battles and sieges. Polish troops under King John III, Sobieski secured victories in Podolia, while Venetian forces expanded influence along the Dalmatian coast and the Peloponnese. Russian armies advanced south into Crimea and the Black Sea region, taking advantage of the Ottomans' preoccupation on multiple fronts. The Ottomans attempted counter-campaigns, including efforts to retake Transylvanian territories and defend Buda. Yet these were hindered by internal disorganization, overstretched resources and growing discontent among the Janissaries. Once the backbone of Ottoman military dominance, the Janissaries had become politically volatile and resistant to reform. Domestically, administrative stagnation persisted. Successive sultans, particularly Suleiman II and Ahmed II, lacked the personal authority and vision of their predecessors. Real power continued to rest with the Grand Viziers, whose capacity to reform was increasingly limited by the scale of the crises. Inflation worsened, public discontent grew, and attempts to raise revenue through currency debasement and increased taxation aggravated economic pressures. The Ottoman navy also faced setbacks. Venetian fleets, supported by Western allies, challenged Ottoman dominance in the eastern Mediterranean. Battles around the Aegean Islands and the Peloponnese resulted in territorial losses. Athens briefly fell under Venetian control, and the Parthenon, used by the Ottomans as a gunpowder magazine, was severely damaged during bombardment in 1687. One key reason for declining military performance was the lack of innovation in structure and tactics. European armies had adopted stricter discipline, standardized drilling, advanced firearms, and integrated battlefield strategies. While the Ottomans remained capable, they had not kept pace. Reliance on traditional cavalry and outdated siege methods left their forces increasingly vulnerable against modern European armies. By the closing years of the 17th century, the Ottomans had lost most of Hungary, large parts of Transylvania, and critical Balkan fortresses. Sensing imperial fatigue and financial strain, their opponents pressed for formal resolution. After prolonged negotiations, the Treaty of Karlowitz was signed in 1699. It became one of the most consequential diplomatic agreements in Ottoman history. For the first time, the empire ceded significant European territory. The Habsburgs retained Hungary and Transylvania, Poland regained Podolia, and Venice secured portions of Dalmatia and the Peloponnese. Although Russia's settlement followed slightly later with the Treaty of Constantinople in 1700, Karlowitz had already signaled a broader Ottoman retreat. The treaty's significance lay in the symbolic shift it represented. The Ottoman Empire was no longer viewed as an unstoppable force pressing into Christian lands. It had become a reactive power, defending rather than expanding. Karlowitz marked the end of Ottoman territorial expansion in Europe and the start of a managed period of containment and adaptation. In the years immediately after the treaty, the Ottoman court undertook a wave of intellectual and military self-examination. Statesmen debated how to adjust to the new geopolitical reality. Some early reforms were attempted in the 18th century, but the psychological impact of Karlowitz lingered, creating a crisis of identity. How could an empire founded on conquest maintain legitimacy while in retreat? Despite territorial losses, the empire did not collapse. It remained one of the most populous and diverse states in the world, with vast holdings in the Middle East, North Africa, and southeastern Europe. It retained critical economic networks, religious authority, and control over strategic trade routes and pilgrimage paths. Yet the era of unilateral Ottoman dominance had clearly ended. In Europe, Karlowitz emboldened the Habsburgs and encouraged strategic alliances and territorial consolidation. In Russia, the Ottoman retreat opened opportunities for expansion into the Black Sea and the Caucasus. For the Ottomans, the 18th century required adaptation in military affairs, governance, diplomacy, and thought. The new century found the Ottoman Empire in a transformed world. Karlowitz had ended its expansionist phase, ushering in a long period of recalibration and selective reform. Though still vast, spanning 3 continents, the empire was no longer a dominant military juggernaut. Its challenge now was not conquest, but effective governance, strategic defense, and maintaining relevance in a European-dominated geopolitical landscape defined increasingly by science, diplomacy, and commerce. This transition was epitomized by the Tulip era. Roughly from the early 1700s to the mid-1720s, more than a fascination with flowers, it represented cultural experimentation, artistic revival, and tentative engagement with European ideas, named for the elite's widespread cultivation of tulips. The period reflected a desire to blend Ottoman tradition with new styles, tastes, and intellectual currents. The Tulip era began under Sultan Ahmed III, who reigned from 1703 to 1730. His court, influenced by Grand Vizier Nevşehirli Damat Ibrahim Pasha, pursued architectural patronage, literary production, and diplomatic curiosity. Istanbul saw the construction of pleasure gardens, fountains, libraries, and residences incorporating French Rococo elements into Ottoman design. This aesthetic shift indicated a willingness to adopt European ideas through cultural exchange rather than military conquest. A significant development was the establishment of the first Ottoman printing press using Arabic script in 1727 by Ibrahim Mutafarrika, a Hungarian convert to Islam. The press faced both enthusiasm and resistance, allowing broader circulation of scientific, historical, and geographic works, while religious authorities cautiously limited its use. Forbidding religious texts for decades diplomatically, the Ottomans began adopting new practices. Though permanent embassies were not yet standard, envoys to European capitals returned with detailed observations on science, industry, and military organization, gradually influencing reformist thinking at the Ottoman court. However, the Tulip era was not universally celebrated. The urban poor and disaffected janissaries resented the elite's apparent indulgence, particularly amid worsening living conditions. Economic instability, currency devaluation, and inflation heightened public frustration. Tensions erupted in 1730 with the Patrona Halil rebellion, led by a former janissary turned bathhouse attendant, fueled by rising prices, taxation, and perceived courtly decadence. Rebels stormed the Topkapi Palace, demanding the execution of the Grand Vizier. Sultan Ahmed III, seeking to preserve his throne, complied and had Ibrahim Pasha executed. Soon after, Ahmed himself was deposed and replaced by Mahmud Wasabuns. Though the rebellion ended the Tulip era violently, its legacy endured. Despite opposition to reform, the early 18th century had planted seeds of change. The idea that Ottoman governance could coexist with adaptation, innovation, and cultural openness had entered political discourse. In the following decades, the empire focused on internal consolidation and external diplomacy. The wars of the late 17th century had demonstrated the unsustainability of prolonged conflict with multiple European powers. Ottoman strategy in the 18th century increasingly emphasized managing frontiers, maintaining buffer zones, and engaging in limited conflicts that avoided overextension. Nonetheless, military challenges persisted. The Ottoman Empire entered multiple wars with Russia, whose imperial ambitions now posed the most serious long-term threat to Ottoman territorial integrity. In the Russo-Turkish War of 1735 to 1739, the Ottomans achieved a temporary diplomatic success with the Treaty of Belgrade, regaining some territories in the Balkans and reaffirming control over key sections of the Danube frontier. However, this triumph was short-lived. Russia, under successive czars, continued to modernize its army and navy, expand southward, and establish strategic outposts along the Black Sea. The Crimean Khanate, a long-standing Ottoman vassal, grew increasingly vulnerable to Russian influence and pressure. Meanwhile, Russian diplomacy began to weaken Ottoman alliances and exploit sectarian divisions in border regions. Internally, reform proceeded cautiously. Mahmud I's successors took steps to stabilize finances and improve provincial administration. New military schools were established to train officers in European-style warfare, and efforts were made to improve the production and quality of firearms. Yet many of these reforms were limited in scope and faced resistance from entrenched interests, particularly within the Janissary Corps. Culturally, the 18th century saw a gradual flourishing of literature, calligraphy, and architecture, especially in urban centers like Istanbul, Edirne, and Damascus. Patronage from provincial governors and wealthy merchants supported artistic production even as the central state focused on security and stability. Public works such as schools, mosques, and caravanserais continued to be built, blending classical Ottoman styles with new influences from Persia and Europe. Despite these developments, the empire's structural problems persisted. The tax system remained prone to abuse, rural revolts continued, and the military resisted large-scale modernization. The Janissaries, once elite shock troops, had become a conservative force, jealously guarding their privileges and opposing the introduction of European training or tactics. By the mid to late 18th century, Another major conflict highlighted these contradictions. The Russo-Turkish War of 1768 to 1774 proved one of the most devastating the empire had faced in generations. Ottoman forces, plagued by poor logistics and outdated strategies, suffered humiliating defeats. Russian troops advanced deep into the Balkans, occupied Crimea, and conducted naval attacks in the Aegean Sea. The war concluded with the Treaty of Küçükkaynarca in 1774. With far-reaching consequences, the treaty recognized Russia's influence over the Crimean Khanate and granted it the right to intervene on behalf of Orthodox Christians within Ottoman territories. This provision offered Russia a diplomatic pretext for future interference in Ottoman internal affairs and marked a significant erosion of sovereignty. Psychologically, the treaty was a blow. For the first time, the Ottomans were forced to make substantial concessions to a Christian power. The empire appeared not only contained but vulnerable, subject to external dictates and internal fragmentation. By the final quarter of the 18th century, the Ottoman Empire faced mounting crises. Militarily weakened, diplomatically exposed and economically strained, the state struggled to defend its vast territories. The Treaty of Küçükkaynarca had stripped the Ottomans of strategic lands like Crimea and empowered Russia to intervene under the guise of protecting Orthodox Christians, a mechanism that would repeatedly challenge Ottoman authority internally. Stagnation, resistance to reform, and provincial fragmentation worsened. The central government in Istanbul no longer exercised full control. In the Balkans, Arab provinces, and Egypt, powerful local notables, or ayans, operated with significant autonomy, collecting taxes, raising militias, and negotiating with foreign powers. Into this fractured landscape came Sultan Selim III, who ascended the throne in 1789, a cultured and reform-minded ruler. Selim was educated in philosophy, literature, and diplomacy. Aware of the empire's declining military and administrative efficiency, he drew inspiration from European models, especially France, with which he maintained correspondence. Selim launched a bold and controversial series of reforms aimed at modernizing Ottoman institutions. Central to his program was the creation of a Western-style army, the Nizam-e-Jadid, or New Order. This force was intended to replace the outdated, increasingly undisciplined Janissary Corps. The Nizam-e-Jadid was trained in European tactics, equipped with modern weapons and organized under a separate command structure reporting directly to the Sultan. To fund the reforms, Selim established a new treasury supported by additional taxes and revenues from crown lands. In tandem with military reform, Selim sought to improve education, standardize provincial administration, and promote secular technical knowledge. He sent delegations to European capitals to study advancements in science, engineering, and statecraft. Istanbul saw the opening of new schools, translation bureaus, and printing presses focused on military science and geography. Selim's approach was both pragmatic and visionary, based on the belief that survival in the modern world required internal transformation. Yet these reforms faced fierce resistance from entrenched interests, particularly the Janissaries, conservative religious scholars, and provincial elites. Many viewed Selim's initiatives as threats to their privileges and a betrayal of traditional Ottoman Islamic identity. This opposition culminated in a revolt in 1807. The Janissaries, supported by elements of the ulama and powerful ayans, rebelled in Istanbul. Selim was forced to abdicate, and his cousin Mustafa IV was placed on the throne. Shortly after, Selim was imprisoned and executed, extinguishing the first major attempt at comprehensive reform from above. Despite his death, the momentum for change persisted. In Manisa, a young prince, Mahmud, half-brother of Mustafa IV, was hidden by loyalists. Reformist officials, led by Mustafa Babadar, orchestrated a coup to restore reformist authority in Istanbul, deposing Mustafa IV and installing Mahmud as sultan in 1808. Mahmud Seku inherited an empire on the brink of collapse. He had witnessed Selim's failure and understood that lasting reform required not just policy changes, but a fundamental restructuring of power. Over the next 3 decades, Mahmud pursued a gradual but determined program of centralization and reform, aimed at dismantling reactionary factions and rebuilding imperial authority. His defining act came in 1826, known as the Auspicious Incident. After years of planning, Mahmud ordered the destruction of the Janissary Corps. When they revolted against new military regulations, loyal troops and artillery were mobilized to crush them. Thousands of Janissaries were killed, imprisoned, or exiled, their barracks destroyed, and privileges permanently revoked. This eliminated the empire's single greatest obstacle to reform. Mahmud established a new army, the Asakiri Mansura-i Muhammadiyeh, or Victorious Soldiers of Muhammad, modelled on European standing armies and marking the beginning of a modern military institution under full state control. Following the Janissaries' suppression, Mahmud expanded reforms. He reorganized provincial administration, curbed the power of local ayans, and established a more direct tax collection system. The imperial bureaucracy was restructured with European-style ministries and merit-based appointments, gradually replacing the traditional scribal class with professionally trained civil servants. Culturally, Mahmud embraced modernization without abandoning Ottoman Islamic traditions. Western-style clothing was adopted for court officials, printed materials were encouraged, and educational reforms combined religious and secular curricula. New schools for civil and military training were founded, many teaching in French and employing European instructors. However, Mahmud's reign was not without turmoil. The Greek War of Independence, beginning in 1821, proved one of the most damaging conflicts. Inspired by European nationalist movements, Greek revolutionaries launched a widespread rebellion against Ottoman rule. The war was brutal, with atrocities committed by both sides, and international sympathy for Greece grew rapidly. European powers, particularly Britain, France, and Russia, intervened on the Greeks' behalf. In 1827, their combined fleets destroyed the Ottoman-Egyptian navy at the Battle of Navarino. This decisive defeat made Ottoman suppression impossible and led to the recognition of an independent Greek state in 1830. The loss of Greece marked the first major territorial secession in the modern era of nationalist revolutions and set a precedent for future separatist movements. In Egypt, Muhammad Ali Pasha, Ottoman governor, capitalized on early 19th century chaos to consolidate power and establish a virtually independent state. He modernized Egypt's army, economy, and administration, turning it into a semi-autonomous power that rivaled Istanbul. Although nominally loyal to the Sultan, Muhammad Ali pursued an aggressive foreign policy, eventually clashing with the Ottoman central government. By the end of his reign, Mahmud had laid the institutional groundwork for the Tanzimat reforms. His achievements went beyond policy, reshaping the structure of Ottoman governance through the elimination of the Janissaries, creation of modern institutions, and reassertion of imperial authority. He redefined what it meant to be an Ottoman ruler in the modern age. Mahmud II died in 1839, leaving a state more centralized, disciplined, and prepared for the turbulent decades ahead. Although the empire's geopolitical decline was not reversed, its internal framework had been transformed. In the wake of Mahmud II's reign, the Ottoman Empire entered a new phase, defined not by conquest, but by reform and adaptation. The 19th century brought external pressures from European imperialism and rising nationalist movements, alongside the internal challenge of reconciling Islamic traditions with the administrative and legal reforms necessary to survive in a modern competitive world. This era was inaugurated by the Tanzimat period, named for the Arabic term for reorganization. Spanning from the proclamation of the Gülhane Edict in 1839 to the promulgation of the first Ottoman constitution in 1876, the Tanzimat period was marked by unprecedented efforts to modernize the empire's legal administrative, educational, and social systems, aiming to create a more centralized, rational, and equitable society within the multi-ethnic, multi-religious Ottoman state. The Tanzimat era officially began with the proclamation of the Gulhain Hatta Sharif, or the Noble Edict of the Rose Chamber, by Sultan Abdulmajid in the gardens of the Topkapi Palace, drafted by the reformist statesman Mustafa Reshid Pasha. The edict laid out the principles that would guide reform over the following decades. It promised to guarantee the life, honor, and property of all subjects, regardless of religion, reform tax collection, ensure fair and consistent conscription, and improve judicial procedures. What made this edict revolutionary was not just its content, but its inclusive tone. It emphasized that all Ottoman subjects, Muslims, Christians, and Jews alike, were to be treated equally under the law. This represented a marked departure from the traditional Islamic millet system, which had historically granted religious minorities autonomy in exchange for political subordination. The new direction of the Tanzimat challenged these old structures and sought to build a common Ottoman identity rooted in civic rather than religious loyalty. One of the most significant reforms was the introduction of new legal codes. Heavily influenced by the French Civil Code, the Ottomans implemented the Mesel, a codified version of Islamic civil law adapted to modern legal procedures. This legal overhaul created courts that operated according to secular principles, offering legal avenues accessible to all subjects regardless of religious affiliation. These developments streamlined legal processes and represented a major step toward the secularization of public life. Administrative reforms also gained momentum. New provincial governance laws reduced the power of local notables and brought peripheral regions under tighter central control. The Vilayet law of 1864 reorganized the empire's provinces into a hierarchical structure, with appointed governors reporting directly to the central government in Istanbul. This helped curtail the autonomy of regional elites and integrate the provinces more fully into the imperial bureaucracy. In tandem with administrative restructuring, the Tanzimat period saw a significant expansion of public education. The state founded numerous secular schools that operated alongside traditional Islamic institutions. These schools taught subjects such as mathematics, geography, and modern languages, and many were staffed by instructors trained in Europe. Military and technical schools were also expanded to support the empire's modernization of its armed forces and infrastructure. Equally significant were reforms in taxation and finance. The state moved toward a more standardized and predictable tax system, aiming to reduce abuses of tax farming, which had long enriched local elites at the expense of rural populations. At the same time, the empire engaged more heavily with European capital markets. This led to the establishment of modern banks, increased foreign loans, and eventually the creation of the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, a European-controlled body tasked with managing the empire's debt payments. While foreign investment improved infrastructure, it also exposed the empire to greater external economic control. Perhaps the most visible sign of the Tanzimat reforms was the transformation of urban life. Cities such as Istanbul, Beirut, Izmir, and Salonika began to resemble European counterparts in architecture and daily life. Newspapers flourished. Coffee houses became centers of debate and intellectual exchange. A new Ottoman middle class, composed of merchants, bureaucrats, and professionals, began to emerge. This class played a vital role in spreading reformist ideas and advocating for civic rights. However, the Tanzimat reforms also exposed deep contradictions within the Ottoman system. While the central government promoted equality and uniform laws, large segments of the population resisted these changes. Many conservative Muslims viewed the reforms as a betrayal of Islamic principles and feared that the erosion of religious distinctions would weaken their privileged position. At the same time, non-Muslim communities often saw the reforms not as emancipation, but as inadequate responses to their aspirations for autonomy or independence. Indeed, the promise of equality ignited new demands. In the Balkans, Slavic and Greek populations increasingly pushed for national rights, influenced by the wave of nationalism spreading across Europe. In Mount Lebanon and the Syrian provinces, sectarian tensions between Maronite Christians, Druze and Muslims led to violent outbreaks, notably the 1860 massacres in Damascus and the Mount Lebanon Civil War. These incidents required foreign intervention and complicated Ottoman efforts to maintain a balance between reform and imperial unity. Meanwhile, the empire's relationship with European great powers became increasingly entangled. The Crimean War of 1853 to 1856, fought against Russia with British and French support, ended in a formal Ottoman victory, but deepened the empire's dependence on European diplomacy and finance. The Treaty of Paris, which followed, recognized the Ottoman Empire as part of the concert of Europe. But it also indicated that the empire's sovereignty was conditional, subject to European oversight and intervention. Following the war, Sultan Abdülmecid's successor, Sultan Abdulaziz, continued the reform program but faced growing opposition. His extravagant spending, particularly on military modernization and palace construction, worsened the empire's financial crisis. In 1876, amid economic turmoil and political unrest, Abdulaziz was deposed and died under mysterious circumstances, likely murdered. His removal marked a broader shift in Ottoman politics from cautious reform imposed from above to radical demands for constitutionalism from below. This demand crystallized during the brief reign of Sultan Murad II and the subsequent ascension of Sultan Abdülhamid II. In 1876, a new Ottoman constitution was promulgated, marking the formal end of the Tanzimat period and the beginning of the first constitutional era. Drafted by reformist intellectuals and officials, the constitution introduced a bicameral legislature, guaranteed civil liberties, and affirmed equality among all Ottoman subjects. However, this experiment with constitutional governance was short-lived. Within 2 years, Abdülhamid II suspended the parliament and ruled as an autocrat. Nonetheless, the constitutional moment of 1876 revealed that the Ottoman world had irrevocably changed. Ideas of law, representation, rights, and reform had taken root and could not be erased by royal decree. The Tanzimat period remains one of the most consequential chapters in Ottoman history. It represented a sincere, if uneven, attempt to save the empire not through conquest or repression, but through integration, modernization, and legal transformation. It introduced a new language of governance and a vision of Ottoman identity that sought to reconcile diversity with unity, tradition with progress. As the Tanzimat era ended in 1876, the Ottoman Empire entered a new and volatile period. The ambitious legal, administrative, and social reforms had created a more centralized and modernized state in some respects, but they also exposed deep contradictions and pressures. The promise of equal rights and Ottomanism had not quelled rising nationalism among ethnic and religious groups, nor resolved persistent weaknesses in military readiness, economic sustainability, or imperial governance. This new chapter opened with the reign of Sultan Abdülhamid II, who came to power in 1876 during a time of crisis. His predecessor, Murad II, had reigned only a few months before being deposed on grounds of mental instability. Abdülhamid, initially seen as a reform-minded ruler, was responsible for promulgating the first Ottoman constitution, the Kanun-i Esasi. This constitution established a bicameral legislature and laid the groundwork for a limited constitutional monarchy. It was a moment of optimism, especially for those hoping to curb absolutism and create a more representative political system. However, that optimism was short-lived. Within 2 years, citing instability, war, and internal dissent, Abdülhamid suspended the constitution and dissolved parliament. He then ruled as an absolute monarch, beginning the period known as the Hamidian era. This phase was marked by intense centralization, censorship, surveillance, and state control. One of Abdülhamid's core strategies was to emphasize Islamic unity as a counterbalance to European imperialism and internal nationalism. As caliph of all Muslims, he sought loyalty among Muslim subjects from the Balkans to Arabia and Central Asia. He invested in infrastructure to connect the empire's Muslim heartlands, including telegraph lines and railroads such as the Hejaz Railway, linking Damascus to Medina and enhancing pilgrimage routes and imperial cohesion. Yet this policy of pan-Islamism came at a cost. It alienated many non-Muslim populations, especially Christians in the Balkans and Armenians in Anatolia, who increasingly sought protection and inspiration outside the empire. Nationalist sentiments, once marginal, crystallized into organized movements. The Balkans became the most volatile region. Serbia and Montenegro waged war against the Ottomans in the late 1870s, followed by a major uprising in Bulgaria. These revolts, often brutally suppressed, drew international condemnation. The Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878 erupted shortly after. Russia, claiming to protect Slavic and Orthodox populations, inflicted a devastating military defeat on the Ottomans. Russian troops advanced deep into the Balkans, reaching the outskirts of Istanbul. The war concluded with the Treaty of San Stefano, granting large territorial concessions to Russia and creating an enlarged autonomous Bulgaria. However, other European powers, particularly Britain and Austria-Hungary, were alarmed by Russian dominance in the Balkans. At the Congress of Berlin in 1878, the treaty was revised. Bulgaria was divided, and Bosnia was placed under Austro-Hungarian administration, though formally remaining Ottoman territory. The empire lost control over significant regions, including parts of the Caucasus, and its authority in the Balkans was permanently weakened. Internally, the loss of territory triggered a massive influx of Muslim refugees, Circassians, Bosniaks, Albanians, and Crimean Tatars, into Ottoman lands. Displaced by Russian expansion or local hostilities, they were resettled in Anatolia and remaining Balkan territories. While they contributed to the empire's demography and economy, their arrival also heightened tensions in already unstable regions. Abdulhamid responded by intensifying control. He expanded the network of spies and informants, suppressed dissent, and delayed further reforms. Despite his authoritarianism, his reign saw significant investment in education, healthcare, and infrastructure. New schools, hospitals, and universities were established, and he promoted science and engineering, provided they did not challenge his authority. Nevertheless, discontent grew, especially among the educated elite. Young intellectuals, civil servants, and military officers were frustrated by censorship, corruption, and the lack of political participation. Some began organizing in secret, forming the coalition later known as the Young Turks, a diverse group of constitutionalists, liberal bureaucrats, and exiled intellectuals determined to restore the constitution and modernize the empire along European lines. The Young Turk movement gained significant momentum in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Many of its leaders operated in exile from cities like Paris, Geneva, and Cairo, using newspapers and clandestine networks to spread their ideas. They criticized the despotism of Abdulhamid and called for a return to parliamentary government, legal equality, and rational administration. Within the military, a parallel reformist sentiment emerged. Many young officers trained in modern military schools and exposed to European doctrine grew disillusioned with the Sultan's centralization and the empire's repeated defeats. These officers formed secret cells that eventually coalesced into the Committee of Union and Progress, or KP. Though initially a small group, the KP would come to dominate Ottoman politics in the years ahead. The turning point arrived in 1908. A group of reformist army officers in the Macedonian garrison revolted, demanding the restoration of the constitution. Faced with military disobedience and fearing wider insurrection, the Sultan capitulated. The constitution was reinstated and elections were held for a new parliament. This marked the beginning of the Second Constitutional Era, a brief but intense period of political experimentation, pluralism, and renewed hope for reform. The Young Turks, particularly the KP, quickly gained prominence in this new political landscape. However, their rise was far from uncontested. The early years of constitutionalism were marked by factionalism, competing visions for the empire's future, and a series of crises. In 1909, conservative forces attempted to restore Abdul Hamid's absolute rule in a counter-coup. The rebellion was suppressed, and the Sultan was deposed. His brother, Mehmed V, ascended the throne, though real power soon rested with the Cup. The following years were turbulent. The Cup began to centralize authority, restrict opposition, and implement policies of Turkification in response to rising nationalism among non-Turkish populations. These measures alienated many groups within the empire, including Arabs, Armenians, and Albanians. Nationalist movements intensified, and separatist ambitions grew stronger. Internationally, the empire continued to lose ground. In 1912 and 1913, it suffered catastrophic defeats in the Balkan Wars. The Ottomans lost nearly all remaining European territories, including Macedonia, Albania, and most of Thrace. Istanbul was now the only major Ottoman city west of the Bosphorus. The loss of the Balkans triggered further demographic shifts as hundreds of thousands of Muslim refugees, many destitute, fled to Anatolia. These social upheavals strained the empire's capacity to maintain order and cohesion. Meanwhile, the Cup, now firmly in control, turned toward militarization and national unity as solutions to imperial decline. Figures such as Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, and Kemal Pasha rose to prominence, advocating for a centralized Ottoman identity rooted in Turkish nationalism. By the eve of the First World War, the Ottoman Empire had transformed yet again. It had moved from cautious reform under Abdul Hamid to constitutional experimentation under the Young Turks, and finally to a militarized nationalist regime led by a small group of ideologues. The Sultan, now a figurehead, played little role in governance. The empire remained vast and complex, but its future was increasingly uncertain. External threats loomed, internal divisions festered, and the ideals of reform and constitutionalism had given way to authoritarian pragmatism. The Ottoman Empire entered the 20th century diminished but still resilient. Though its military reach had receded and internal divisions deepened, it remained a sovereign state stretching across Anatolia, the Arab lands, and parts of southeastern Europe. Its rulers still bore the titles of Sultan and Caliph, and Istanbul remained a major center of Islamic learning, diplomacy, and trade. Yet the outbreak of the First World War in 1914 would bring an end to this 600-year-old empire. It was not a sudden collapse, but a rapid sequence of political decisions, military defeats, and revolutionary movements that unraveled centuries of imperial rule. In the early stages of the war, the Committee of Union and Progress, consolidated after the Balkan Wars, aligned the empire with the Central Powers, Germany, and Austria-Hungary. This decision was made in hopes of regaining lost territories and asserting Ottoman influence against growing European encroachment. Empire leaders, particularly Enver Pasha, believed war offered a final opportunity to reshape the empire's fortunes. The gamble proved catastrophic. The Ottomans entered the war on multiple fronts, against Russia in the Caucasus, the British in Mesopotamia and the Suez, and later the French in Syria and Lebanon. Though some military successes were achieved, such as the defense of the Dardanelles at Gallipoli in 1915, the overall trajectory was one of strategic overextension and grinding defeat. One of the darkest chapters of this period was the deportation and mass killing of Armenians in the eastern provinces, justified by the Cup leadership as a wartime security measure against alleged Armenian collaboration with Russian forces. These actions escalated into widespread massacres and forced marches, resulting in the deaths of hundreds of thousands. Widely recognized today as the Armenian genocide, it remains one of the most tragic episodes of the First World War and casts a long shadow over the late Ottoman state. Simultaneously, Arab provinces began to fracture from Istanbul's control. The Arab Revolt, launched in 1916 with British support and led by Sharif Hussein of Mecca, undermined Ottoman authority in the Hijaz and beyond. The revolt reflected genuine discontent with the Kupi's centralizing and Turkifying policies, which alienated Arab intellectuals and leaders. By the end of the war in 1918, Ottoman forces had suffered massive losses. British and Arab troops captured Baghdad, Jerusalem, and Damascus. The once vast empire was reduced to Anatolia and parts of northern Mesopotamia. On October 30, 1918, the Ottomans signed the Armistice of Mudros, effectively ending their participation in the war and opening the door to Allied occupation. In the immediate post-war years, the empire faced not only defeat, but dismemberment. Under the Treaty of Sèvres in 1920, large portions of Ottoman territory were allocated to European powers. Greece occupied western Anatolia, France took southeastern regions, Italy claimed parts of the south, and Britain solidified control over Iraq and Palestine. The treaty also proposed an independent Armenia and international oversight of the Straits. These arrangements sparked outrage among the Turkish population and ignited a nationalist movement led by former Ottoman officer Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk. A resistance movement emerged to overturn the Treaty of Sèvres and establish a new Turkish state based on sovereignty, independence, and national identity. Over the next 3 years, this nationalist movement waged a successful campaign against foreign occupation and the remnants of the Ottoman regime. The Turkish War of Independence culminated in the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, recognizing the borders of the new Republic of Turkey and nullifying the previous treaty. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Sultanate was formally abolished in 1922, ending a 6th-century monarchy. The Caliphate itself was abolished shortly thereafter in 1924. The last Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed VI, left Istanbul aboard a British warship in November 1922, marking the symbolic and institutional end of the Ottoman Empire. What remained was a republic, secular, nationalist, and determined to break with the imperial past. The story of the Ottoman Empire is not simply one of rise and fall. It is a narrative of adaptation, resilience, complexity, and transformation. Over 6 centuries, the empire shaped the political, cultural, and religious landscape of the Eastern Mediterranean, the Middle East, North Africa, and Southeastern Europe. It was home to diverse peoples, languages, and faiths united under a system that, despite contradictions, endured longer than any other early modern empire. The Ottomans did not collapse in a single moment. Their decline was uneven, their reforms sincere yet limited, and their challenges both external and internal. They made concerted efforts to modernize, centralize, integrate, and compete with rising European powers. Some efforts succeeded, others failed. The Tanzimat and later constitutional movements introduced ideas of citizenship, equality, and legal reform that outlived the empire itself. The final century of the empire offers lessons in the fragility of multi-ethnic governance in an age of nationalism, and the limits of top-down reform in the face of entrenched interests, global shifts, and unresolved social tension. The Ottoman experience reminds us that empires are not static. They evolve, react, and sometimes resist the very changes that might prolong their survival. Today, the legacy of the Ottoman Empire endures. Borders drawn in its aftermath continue to shape modern conflicts and state formations. Institutions, laws, and cultural expressions from Ottoman rule remain part of the social and political fabric of modern Turkey, the Balkans, and the broader Middle East. Perhaps the most enduring lesson is that history is not merely a record of triumphs and defeats. It is a living process, contested, interpreted, and reshaped by each generation. The story of the Ottoman Empire invites reflection on how states rise, endure, and ultimately give way to new forms of identity, governance, and memory. It is a reminder that every empire is, in the end, a human endeavor, ambitious, flawed, and deeply consequential.